Hi, my name is Vincent, and I'm a machine learning engineer over at Explosion. In this video, I'm going to show you a trick that I like to call bulk labeling that can really speed up data annotation when you're just about to start with a text classification use case. By the end of this video, you'll know how to use the interactive interface that you're seeing here to quickly bootstrap interesting subsets for annotation. The technique leverages pre-existing language models to help you discover clusters of text, and this technique is also something that we'll discuss in this video. Finally, I will also show you how I like to use this technique as part of my Prodigy workflow. But before we get to all of that, let's first discuss a dataset and a task, just to make a very tangible starting point. So let's talk about the dataset and task that I'll be using in this video. As you can see here in Jupyter, I am loading in a dataset.csv file. This file has a column called text. And this column text over here that's in that data frame contains tweets that people are sending to a grocery store. A lot of them are about complaints, as one might expect. But some of these tweets will be about a delivery. And that might be an interesting business case to track and to detect. If more and more complaints about deliveries are taking place, that's useful information to both the customer service department and maybe also the delivery department, let's say. So that means that I'm going to start annotating, and maybe a good tactic to get an interesting subset to start out with is to look at all the examples that contain this deliver substring. And sure enough, if I do that in this pandas data frame, then I get examples back that indeed seem to be about a delivery. So what I could do is I could just take a look at all of these examples and pass that on to Prodigy. That would be an interesting subset maybe to start with. And although this trick probably would work, there might also be a downside attached, because I am only going to be getting examples of a delivery where the word deliver literally appears. And that might bias any machine learning algorithm that follows. And it might also influence the annotation process if I want to apply active learning. Because if the active learning algorithm early on overfits on this one term, then it might really take a while before it is able to detect other ways of saying that it's about a late delivery. For example, let's say someone says, "Where is that driver?" Now, this would also be something that I'd be interested in detecting, and you can kind of wonder if an algorithm that's overfitting on this term, if it will ever be able to detect this sentence. So then you might think, okay, maybe we need to work with word tokens. Maybe I need to add the term driver as well. So I don't just match terms like deliver, but also terms like driver. And again, that approach could work, but you are going to have to accept that maybe the term driver also appears in a lot of examples that aren't about a delivery. So in this case, we might need more than just a word list, because we're interested in finding maybe similar sentences, but not so much similar terms. And again, the term driver might be related to a delivery, but only in the right context. So maybe here would be a good time to take a step back and to think about another approach that might work. So taking a step back, we are starting out with some text. And let's also assume that we have lots of text that's not labeled yet, right? That's the situation that we're in. But we do know that there is this class of texts that's about deliveries, and we'd like to detect those. Then the way of thinking about it is that, well, we have words like deliver, and we have words like driver maybe, and maybe you could also say an order that is late, let's say. So you can imagine that there's lots of words that might describe the context that we're interested in. And the assumption that I kind of have is that there ought to be some sort of a cluster of these texts that are very similar, that are in a way close together. The only thing that I need right now is some sort of tool that helps me select this cluster. And with that in mind, there is actually an approach that might allow us to do just this. Because what we could do is we could take this text that we have and we can embed it. So what does that mean? Well, we have these pre-trained language models, think of things like BERT, that can accept text and then give a high-dimensional representation of that text. There's lots of variants of models that do this, but the basic premise of these models is that texts that are similar in context based on the dataset that they've been trained on should also have similar n-dimensional vectors. They should be close to each other. At least that's something that we hope. And what I can then do is, given this n-dimensional vector, I can see if I can maybe reduce that down into a two-dimensional vector. Now, the benefit of having a two-dimensional vector is that I might be able to make a plot. And when I do that, well, then I might be able to make a somewhat large scatter chart, but this scatter chart might have a couple of clusters. Now, the hope is that by making this two-dimensional chart, I might be able to make a quick selection with a user interface to maybe select this portion, and then hopefully everything within this same cluster belongs to the same context. It might be, for example, that eventually over here we have a cluster that's all about opening times, and we might have another cluster, let's say over here, that could be about deliveries. So what I'm describing here is a pipeline and a user interface that might allow you to do something I like to call bulk labeling. This technique is not going to guarantee us perfect labels, but hopefully it is going to be relatively easy to just run this pipeline, make these two-dimensional embeddings, then make this chart, and to then make these selections that allow us to very quickly attach a label to a cluster of data points. In order for this to work very well, we do have to be a little bit lucky. It would be a shame if we have a pre-trained language model, for example, that's been trained on a dataset that's very unlike anything that we are using. It is also possible that we lose too much information in our reduction technique. And it's also possible that we have text that doesn't have enough variability in order for this chart to be meaningful. Having said that, I do think that this bulk labeling idea is going to be very useful in combination with Prodigy. Bulk labeling won't give us perfect annotations, but it will hopefully be able to give us interesting subsets which we can then pass into Prodigy, which can help us verify. And hopefully, what bulk labeling will do is give interesting subsets that go beyond just these matches with strings. And to help me explore this, I have also made a tool called Bulk that you can pip install. So I'm going to use that right now to give a demo of this idea. Before showing you Bulk, the selection tool, I will need to have these embeddings ready first. So here's the code that does exactly that. I am using the sentence transformer library, and I am using this model that I found on the docs. And to generate the embeddings, what I'm doing below is first I am loading the dataset that I had, then I'm plucking the text column out of it, which I'm then passing to this model over here, which again I loaded up front. This gives me a big array X, and I want that to be two-dimensional. So the next thing that I do is I take UMAP, which is my favorite dimensionality reduction technique, and I'm telling it to reduce it down to two components. And that means that this dataset X that I'm passing in there will be turned into a two-dimensional variant over here. So that means that I have a big array with two columns as a result. I am attaching the first column of numbers onto my data frame, and I'm attaching the second one as well, in such a way that this data frame now has an X column as well as a Y column, and these will be both the X and Y coordinates that I'll use for plotting. That also means that the data frame that I currently have looks a bit like this. I have my text, I have the X and I have the Y column over here, and hopefully all the texts that I have over here will now be in clusters which can be visualized using these coordinates. So that leaves me to do the one final thing. I am going to store this on disk. I'm going to say that's now in a ready.csv file, and this is now something that I'll be saving on disk. With the CSV file ready on disk, I can now run Bulk, which is a command line tool, which I'm using from the terminal here. And here I'm giving it the command to bulk some text for me, and in particular I would like to do some bulk labeling on the ready.csv file. And when I run this, then this user interface opens up. The way the interface works is I can make all sorts of interesting selections here. Whatever I select will appear in the table over here, so that allows me to verify what I'm currently selecting. And if I think I've got an interesting subset selected, then I can create a file name to save all of those examples into a separate CSV file, which again, I might then also be able to pass into Prodigy. So I am now going to make my first selection. I think there's an interesting looking cluster over here, so let's select that first. And just from glancing at some of the examples here, I see voucher appear a couple of times. There's another voucher. I can also see something about a club card. So this seems to be a cluster about vouchers and club cards, which could be useful. Not what I'm interested in right now. So let's go ahead and select another region. There's also multiple selection tools available to me, so I can move everything around a little bit, but I can also choose to select with a square box. Now, when I have a look at this cluster over here, it mainly seems to be about the website. Another website mention over here. Something about online happening over here. And I think this is kind of a nice example of a sentence that doesn't have the word website in it, but can't provide a decent service in-store, let alone online. I mean, it is about a website nonetheless, so I am getting interesting clusters over here. That's pretty cool. But what I'm going to do now is just add a little bit of color to this chart over here. So what bulk allows you to do is it allows you to give a couple of keywords, and any sentence with that keyword will light up as a separate color, which might make it easier for me to just explore this space, so to say. So let's do that. I'm going to shut down this server by hitting Control-C. And to get some help text, I can add --help to the command here. And here you can see that we have these keywords that we can supply. So I'll just say keywords. And here I can supply a string with commas to separate the keywords. So let's say I'm interested in delivery. I think I saw club cards and vouchers, so I'll do that as well. And just because we also saw it just now, let's also add website to it. When I run it now, you can see that there are indeed these extra colors attached. The club cards are in red over here, which is also a region we saw earlier. We can see the website region light up over here, but we can also see now that the delivery region seems to be around here. So let's make a selection there. Let's select this region. So this is definitely a nice example. Getting ready for Christmas, but my order never showed up. That's a nice example that doesn't have the word delivery in it, but it is about a delivery. What I will do now, though, is just undo this selection real quick. And I will try to make a somewhat larger selection such that I have most of the green dots. And if I were now to just have a quick look, then it does seem like I'm able to get lots of things that are about a delivery, but certainly not everything. My club card wouldn't scan when I put fuel in the car, please help. I mean, that's clearly not about a delivery. So that means that my bulk labeling technique over here is going to select some elements that are not belonging to the right class, so to say. But in the end, that's fine, because maybe this selection alone will just still save me some time. By only having a look at this region, I will still have some positive and negative examples, but I won't have to go through the entire rest of it. And that might still save me some time in the end. So let's save this into a delivery.csv file. By hitting save there, I can now stop the server, and I can have a look at the file that I just created, namely delivery.csv, and I can indeed see that it got created. So we have a CSV file that we can pass into Prodigy, so let's quickly do that. I'm going to use the textcat.manual recipe. I'm going to save this into a dataset called bulk delivery. The file that I got to pass is this delivery.csv file. And then finally, this recipe, which you can confirm on the docs, will require you to add a label, and I will add the delivery label like so. And when I do that, I get my familiar Prodigy interface over here. So what I'm going to do is I'll be hitting accept and reject, depending on what I see here. And I'll keep on labeling, but I will stop once in a while when I see an interesting example. And then after a while, I should also be able to say how many examples were actually about delivery that are relevant. So we can say something about how perhaps useful this bulk labeling technique is. But this first example that I see over here definitely seems to be about delivery, so that's fine. After a while, I hit this example, and I think this is an interesting one that perhaps deserves a bit more discussion. Because technically, I could say, yeah, it's about delivery, but in particular, it's about the delivery app. So here I can say that it's not exactly about a delivery that actually took place. It's also not really a complaint. To be specific, someone is asking if they can access last year's Christmas shopping list on the delivery app. So here I feel a bit confronted with what this label is supposed to indicate and what it is supposed to do. If I'm interested in a delivery that actually physically took place, then in this case I'm going to have to reject it. However, another option could also be to maybe add some more labels later. I can definitely imagine that having a label for delivery is useful, but maybe another label for app and or website, and maybe also a different label for if it's a complaint or not. By adding more labels, then I can maybe worry a bit less about how the label will be used later, because an application later can maybe mix and match these terms to find interesting data points. In this particular case, though, because it's not about an actual delivery that took place, I am going to hit reject. But this would also be a very good candidate to perhaps flag and discuss with a team, because the right label here really depends on the use case. Okay, this is also a pretty interesting example, I think. Can you help me with an order, please? Now, it's about an order, which is different than the word delivery, but I would argue that in the context that I'm in, this is also a very valid way to make it clear that something went wrong with something you ordered, which is then therefore probably a delivery. So I'm going to hit accept here, but the one thing I do want to sort of observe is that I do get some sentences that belong to the correct context, even though they don't have this word deliver in it. So that's cool. Okay, so I think this next example is actually pretty cool to mention too. So fabulous delivery guy just dropped my shopping in, an absolute credit to you. The reason why I think this is kind of nice is because it's not just complaints, people are also giving compliments, so that's also good. But in this case, it's also not necessarily referring to the delivery or the thing that got delivered. It can also be about the driver, which is what's happening here. So I will hit accept, but also compliments. That's also nice to see. And I think that maybe this example is a nice one to close off with, because it says here, your petrol station at Purley was closed this morning. Is it open again now? Yeah, this is really not about a delivery. I'm wondering if maybe in the embedding space, deliveries and trucks and drivers are perhaps related to petrol stations, and that maybe that's the reason why this pops up. But this is a very nice example of bulk labels are not perfect. This is not about a delivery, so I really need to reject this one example. So by now I've been labeling for a bit. I have 100 annotations in this session. And looking at it, it seems like I have a pretty okay ratio. 78 examples were indeed about delivery, at least according to my first estimate. There were definitely some rejections, but from a gut feeling, this is well beyond 50%. So certainly more than half of the examples are indeed in the context that I'm interested in. So that's great. There are a couple of lessons that I've learned from doing this, and I think there's also a couple of interesting ideas if you want to do this a little bit more in practice. So let's wrap up with some lessons learned and some tricks you might use in the future if you're doing this. So in this video, I've shown you a technique that I like to call bulk labeling. I like to think the technique can be very useful if you are just starting out, but I do want to emphasize that this technique is not perfect. It really favors speed by allowing you to just label something really quick, but how effective it is at actually giving a correct label really depends on your data, the embeddings, and you're going to have to get just a little bit lucky. There are a couple of ideas you might want to play with though. One idea is that you might want to consider different sources of embeddings. If you are in a very niche domain, let's say legal text or biomedical research papers, then having a general BERT model might not be the best thing. That said, nothing is stopping you from taking whatever pre-trained language model you like, which includes any language models that you might have trained yourself on your own custom domain. So that's definitely something that you can still use with this technique. Another thing to keep in the back of your mind is that you can also still use string matching techniques to find interesting subsets. That can definitely still work. And in fact, that might be preferable in a situation where you have lots and lots of data, because this bulk labeling technique can be a bit slow. If you have millions upon millions of sentences that need to be embedded and then also need to be reduced by UMAP, then the computational overhead can be quite large. Which is why, when you're getting started, you might just want to start with a sample. A random sample with 10,000 sentences might also be enough for you to get started. A final thing that might just be interesting to consider as well is that you might be able to repeat the exercise. And to maybe make it a bit more tangible, if I think about the types of complaints and suggestions that I've seen about deliveries in this dataset, then I did start to recognize maybe just a couple of clusters. I've noticed that sometimes deliveries were being discussed in the context of an app or a website. They were having trouble finding the right time in the app, let's say. Then again, I also noticed it was sometimes about time, primarily because a delivery was too late. But sometimes I've also noticed that it was a complaint about a product that was delivered. Someone ordered a bunch of eggs and one of them was broken in the carton, that kind of a thing. But you can imagine if we have clusters within clusters, what we could do is first select a cluster that supposedly is about deliveries, and then we can use that subset to just repeat the same trick. And that brings me to the point that this bulk labeling technique, if I consider just the interface, can also be an interesting way to do a bit of topic discovery. When you don't really know what to expect from a dataset, it is pretty easy to just search around the embedded space and to get a glimpse of things that are close together. That said, I do think that bulk labeling on its own is not going to be enough. If you are going to be training machine learning models, you want to make sure that the models are trained on data that you can trust, and bulk labeling on its own is really good for making subsets, but it's not meant to be a trick that will actually give you the entire dataset. You are still going to want to, one by one, confirm that the examples that you have match what you're trying to predict. These bulk labels are meant to help you get started, but the real bulk of your time, pun intended, is still going to be inside of an annotation tool like Prodigy, because you have to look at the data yourself in order to be able to iterate on it. And a lot of that will depend on the business problem you're trying to solve as well. Things like, do we want to assign a delivery label if the delivery hasn't taken place yet? And what do we do if it's a question that's about the app and how you're supposed to deliver? These are very important questions to answer if you want to label consistently, and that is not something that bulk labels will solve for you. That said, if you are starting out and you're interested in finding interesting subsets, this technique can be quite useful.